Thanks, guys. They'll be back once again with a shipper update coming up in our next block. But for now, joining us with our top story of the day, got our editor-at-large, John Kingston. John, thank you for joining us this morning, as you do every Monday on FreightWaves Now. Today, we're talking all about employment.
Right. So Friday was the monthly employment figure that comes out from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Some very interesting numbers on the truck transportation sector. That's its own little sort of line in the report. So it reported that the number of jobs in the truck transportation sector actually had declined from April. In May, it had dropped 1,900 jobs, even though, as we know, it's a tremendously strong market. There's help wanted signs out all over the place. There's signing bonuses, there's increased pay and all that. And yet the numbers were down. But two things. First of all, those were the seasonally adjusted numbers. The economists always look at seasonally adjusted numbers. Anthony, I'm going to talk about not seasonally adjusted numbers as an economist. I hope you'll forgive me, since I know that those are completely usually ignored. But if you look at the not seasonally adjusted numbers for truck transportation, they were up more than 10,000 on the month. Now, it is possible, the guy who really talked to me Friday and noted this is that right now you're using adjustments that are based on kind of the norm. Well, we're not normal. I mean, we're coming out of a pandemic. So you're doing seasonal adjustment on the basis of things that happened years ago. And now we've got a completely different situation. So Jason's point was that 10,000, almost really 11,000 job gain in the not seasonally adjusted numbers should not be ignored. And it may show that the power of hiring, the strength of hiring is better than the seasonally adjusted numbers would be. There was another couple of numbers that were in there on the number of hours worked, and they are like at the highest level. They've tied for like the most number, 43.3 hours per week in April, and that ties the highest number over the last, let's say, 10 years. And as I think it was Aaron Terrazas from Convoy, who I always speak to after the report comes out, if you compare that to where it was, let's say, 2 years ago, because you don't want to compare anything to last year, because last year is such an outlier. If you compare it to where it was 2 years ago, you're talking about 20,000 additional jobs, just the number of hours worked. So everybody out there is working real hard. They're working lots of hours, not surprising. They're getting a good rate per mile and just good freight rates in general. So that may be one of the things that's holding the market back from being even crazier in terms of rates is that people are working harder and they're putting more hours in. And that is essentially effectively like the creation of another job.
So,
The other
John
point I
Kingston.
wanted to make was that they before Anthony comes in to criticize me for talking about not seasonally adjusted numbers, the PPI number, the PPI number for truck transportation, is up 7.7% in a year. So imagine like if the annual inflation rate for the entire country was 7.7% right now. Right now we could argue about it, but it's probably less than 3%. And you see what's happening in truck transportation; it's up closer to 8 than it is to 7%. So that says quite a bit. Okay, Anthony, have at it.
Well, John, surprisingly, you and I are both on the same page when it comes to non-seasonally
Okay.
adjusted numbers. A lot of times because those are the actual raw numbers. I only talk about seasonally adjusted just because those are the headline numbers and people want to compare apples to apples. But John just said, you can really get a lot of good insights when looking at those non-seasonally adjusted numbers. A lot of times you don't really know what the seasonally adjusted formula goes into them. But John, you mentioned a few great things here to kind of take note of and looking at those worker utility rates. So looking at a lot of people that are returning back to the workforce, working very hard, longer hours, especially before the pandemic. And I think one of those areas that we see is just that lack of labor. I think that's one of the things that we see when we look at any segment, whether there's an increase in actual unemployment or maybe one of the economic theories is if there was a wage increase, there's going to be any type of layoffs for those that weren't kind of at that threshold, and there's going to be more hours worked for a lot more individuals. So, John, in your mind, in your economist's mind, would you fathom that maybe those hours worked and each individual would start to come down as we see more and more truck drivers or people entering the trucking industry?
Well, it's interesting you say that because there's kind of two things going on. As we know, there's a lot of discussion about the $300 a week unemployment benefit. Even President Biden said a couple of days ago that he expects that to expire in September. I think I mentioned on an earlier program here, talking to Todd Amen from ATBS. No, it wasn't Todd, it was somebody else, who said that they handle a lot of processing of applications for various companies. And when the $300 unemployment benefit was passed, they saw a 15% decline in applications like immediately. So clearly that's another factor. But there's a story in the New York Times over the weekend that I think summed up what I've been feeling for a long time. I'm not the only one. There's lots of people who feel this. We're going through a secular change now. I'm part of the baby boom. I'm not planning on retiring, but I have high school friends who have retired. And I have some college friends who have retired. And so what's happening is that baby boom is leaving the workforce. It's followed by years of much lower birth rates. And the baby boom, quite frankly, provided a surplus pool of labor forever, really for 40 years. And that surplus pool of labor is gone, or it's in the process of going. So I don't think that any of these discussions about hiring and it being difficult to hire, and we could talk about the $300 benefit, 2-3 years from now, we're probably going to be having the same conversation, and the $300 a week benefit will be well in the rearview mirror. So I think that the tight labor market is, except for periods of recession when a lot of people get thrown out of work, but the pendulum is definitely swinging back to the employee as having more of an upper hand in the employer-employee relationship. Worker wages have been stagnated really since the 80s. I think that's kind of done. And when you look at the pandemic, right before the pandemic, the wage gains were going to the lowest paid people on the totem pole. The fast food workers were starting to get so much more money that it really made the whole minimum wage discussion moot. I think it is kind of moot because, except maybe in some pockets of terrible economies, who's paying that? Nobody. So I think we're going to have this discussion for a long time to come.
Anthony has his own opinions on minimum wage sentiment as well. So maybe that's something that you should have John Kingston on your Economy Lately episode, and you guys can debate what's going on with the minimum wage. John, when it comes to talking about that employer-employee relationship, we talk a lot about AB5 and how it's kind of going to impact the way that employees are classified, what that means for employers as well. And it's part of our Owner-Operator Summit that's coming up on Wednesday. Make sure that you go register for that. It's a free live event. You did a really good interview talking kind of about what AB5 means in that employee-employer space. Tell us about that interview and what you gained from it.
Well, first of all, let me note that on the Small Fleet Owner Operator Summit, I'm doing 3 interviews. So if you really don't like seeing me on camera, you really don't want to watch it. But if you find me fascinating, I'll be there 3 times. So, but yeah, I did do an interview with Damien Ott, who's an attorney with Littler, the Littler firm, based out in California, doing a lot of work on AB5. We cover a lot of ground. One thing he talked about quite a bit is something I had heard already, which is what does a California trucking firm do to continue to employ independent owner operators and not fall afoul of AB5. And he brought up the whole question, the whole brokerage solution. And really what it is taking your firm that's now a trucking firm and converting it to, I don't know about exclusively, but being more of a brokerage company. So your main activity is not trucking. Your main activity is, putting carriers and shippers together. Therefore, you can hire an independent owner operator. So one thing he said he did not expect to see is trucking companies turning more drivers into company drivers. That's one solution, and quite frankly, that's been the goal of the backers of AB5, like Lorena Gonzalez, the assemblywoman who pushed it. So he doesn't see that happening. He thinks that these companies will convert themselves more to becoming brokers, and as a result of that, they'll still be able to employ owner operators. In fact, the people who are probably going to get maybe find themselves out on the street here would be the company drivers, because they'd be let go. So it allows the company to hire independent owner operators. So, this could be one of these things where be careful what you wish for. You might just get it, and they might get something different than they had planned. So it's a very good interview. It's the kind of thing that we're going to be covering a lot recently, but I would suggest tuning into all 3 of my interviews, but that one in particular was good.
Absolutely do that. And so do you think that kind of, easing away from employing those owner operators as their company employees is going to be more attractive to those owner operators? Because if you're an independent contractor, if you're someone who sets their own hours, takes their own jobs, has their own truck, does their own thing, it's almost difficult to want to assimilate into that company itself. Do you think that not having to make that assimilation is going to be more attractive and keep some of those independent contractors on the road still?
Well, remember, there's kind of two forms of independent owner operators. One are those who are on lease to a company because they're paying off the lease payments on a truck, and so therefore they're very closely tied to whatever company set them up in a lease program. Not really sure what's going to happen with them. And then you have the people who are truly independent who own their own rig, and I don't really know what they have to assimilate for. They're just kind of doing the work at a particular company. So let's say that if this brokerage model is pursued, if this becomes the norm in California, you're going to have a lot of lawyers very busy figuring out the legalities of this. You're going to have a lot of kind of like what you're referring to, a lot of human resources personnel who will be called upon to run their company in an entirely different way. This is going to be a radical change. It's easy to just say, well, they'll just go to the brokerage route, but this has never been done before. I mean, I guess there are probably companies out there that became more brokerage or built up their brokerage operations within the company. But to change your whole model to try to act like a trucking company while you're a brokerage company, it's going to take a lot of lawyers. It's going to take a lot of very good management to do this, and it's going to be a story that will continue to write itself for quite some time.
Well, John Kingston, kind of combining this story and the previous story with employment, I can't help but think that there is also going to be a huge glut or a lack of, I should say, instead, drivers potentially within the market as you see fewer and fewer people in the younger generations taking up trades and things like that. So your opinion on those types of employment opportunities, people that are usually in trades, I think coming from a little bit older generations, and I think younger generations kind of getting pushed more and more into the college route. Do you think this is also going to be an issue as we look towards the trucking industry?
I think certainly that's been talked about a lot, about the fact that, in the past, people who became plumbers or electricians or whatever, that was kind of discouraged. Hey, go to college instead. I think that maybe, again, back to my pendulum, the pendulum might be swinging back to that. I think there's a lot of realization out there that somebody who goes into a trade program, let's say an apprentice program that a union might do, and comes out. I know I have a good friend whose son, he tried college for a while. It didn't really work. He went into the sheet metal workers apprentice program. He came out of that with zero debt, as opposed to somebody who's coming out of 4 years of college with significant debt. And, his pay is, I think $50 an hour regularly. And if he's working overtime, he's probably doing 70, he could be doing 70 or 80 hours, 70 or $80 per hour. So I don't know. I think that whole kind of anti-trade view that kind of grew up for a while, hey, go to college instead. I don't know. I think that's kind of ending, and people are starting to realize there's no point in sending somebody to college who's not really cut out for college when they could very well do extremely well at a trade like welders or the list is long. Welders, plumbers, electricians, or truck drivers.
100% agree with that. Coming from someone who is in that younger generation who just finished college not too long ago, we will say that there's that changing mindset among millennials and even that Zillennial Gen Z generation that skilled labor and trade labor is not failure labor. John, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Go catch his 3 interviews. That's Wednesday on our Owner Operator Summit.